A long time ago on the channel, we did the ABCs of movies where I went through each letter of the alphabet and picked my favorite movie for each. You can watch that video right here. So I thought it would be fun to come back in October and do the best horror film for each letter in the alphabet. Now, because there are less horror films than there are just films in general, I had to change the rules a bit. In the previous video, I disqualified any movie that started with the, but for this case, we're going to include those. Without further ado, I'm Josh from Just Mash. Let's figure it out. A for An American Werewolf in London. To me, An American Werewolf in London is the greatest romantic tragedy of the horror genre. It's a film that contains multitudes. It's obviously known as one of the most funny horror films ever, and rightfully so. But I think the romantic subplot and through line of the film is really what kind of gravitates me towards it. On top of that, werewolves are one of my favorite subgenres of horror, and I think the actual transformation scene in this film is maybe the greatest display of practical effects in movies ever. B for The Blair Witch Project. Found footage is a controversial genre in horror. Some people love it, some people hate it. I am someone that really likes found footage when it's done well, and The Blair Witch Project is probably the best example of a found footage horror movie that works. I'm not old enough to have been around for people who thought it was real, but I think all of the lore and the marketing behind the film is cool enough that I'm cool with just acting like it's real. I know it doesn't do a whole lot of show in the movie in terms of scary objects or things that happen, but I think enough of it is implied that it's still creepy and it just works for me. Also one of the greatest endings in horror films ever. C for The Conjuring. The Conjuring for me is one of those landmark horror films because it came out at the right exact time in my life when I was about 14 or 15 years old. I remember The Conjuring came out and it was the movie of the summer. The commercials on TV were creepy, the trailers were creepy, everybody was talking about how creepy this movie was. I probably saw it the year after and unanimously agreed it is one of the creepiest films I've ever seen. I think James Wan was able to craft such a creepy atmosphere with this film, and it's one that still holds true today. The sequels are what the sequels are, but nothing can change the magic of that first film. D for The Descent. The Descent is one of the most underrated horror films out there. I know it has a sequel that's not so good, but The Descent is a movie that everyone should go out of their way to watch. One of the best examples of claustrophobic horror. This movie has its setting and it's tight and it really creeps you out just based off the setting alone. The monsters in The Descent are really cool, and the way that their monsters are introduced throughout the film are really cool and reward you on a rewatch. E for The Exorcist. The Exorcist might be the greatest horror film ever made. Certainly for me, it's in the top 5 horror films ever made. I can kind of look back at it as the first horror film that truly terrified me. As a kid, I kind of created this mythology for the film in my mind about what it was without ever actually having seen it, but the face of the Exorcist Reagan, she would be the classic jump scare on every YouTube video that you'd ever see. So for me, it just kind of had a life of its own. Once I saw it as an adult, I was proven right. It is one of the scariest movies ever, and it's still one that truly creeps me out. F for Funny Games. Now, Funny Games isn't necessarily a conventional horror movie. I don't know that everyone would describe it that way, but for me, it's one of the creepiest movies ever made. Partially because it's realistic. It's something that can and does happen. It feels like this nightmarish hellscape that lasts for about 90 minutes, but it's truly one of the most disgusting, terrifying things you can watch. It's a violating film that plays with what we know about filmmaking, the different techniques involved in making a film. It kind of picks up on those things and manipulates them to mess with the viewer's mind. The remake is horrible, but the original Funny Games is one of the greatest movies ever. G for Green Room. Green Room is another that's not necessarily conventional horror, maybe a bit more of a thriller, but there's some scary elements to it. Patrick Stewart does a phenomenal job in this film as a villain. The setting is really creepy, and the film just takes you on a wild, intense, adrenaline-fueled ride. H for Halloween. What is there to say about Halloween that hasn't already been said? It really is one of the greatest films of all time. I think Michael Myers is probably one of the greatest figureheads in horror ever. For me, over Freddy and Jason. Say what you want about the sequels, you know, they are what they are, but that original Halloween film is truly one of the greatest movies ever made. I for Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the '78 version, is a remake, and I haven't seen the original, but this film to me is incredible. Donald Sutherland is one of my favorite actors, and he does such an amazing job with this film. It feels so realistic and hopeless in the way that the aliens take over, but it feels like that's exactly how it would happen. Any sort of infection film is always kind of creepy to me, but this film is probably the best of the subgenre. And it's got one of the most iconic endings of all time. J for Jaws. Now, Jaws, another film that, what else can you say about it that hasn't already been said? It's not one that I think of as conventional horror, but when you really think about it, it is a horror film, and there are plenty of scary sequences in the film. It's also a beach horror film, which doesn't happen often. I personally think Jaws is Spielberg's best film. I'm really not even sure what I would consider number 2. That's how good I think Jaws is. K for Killer Clowns from Outer Space. Now, is Killer Clowns from Outer Space the best K horror movie? Maybe not. For me, though, it absolutely is. Some of the most fun you could ever have watching a film will be during Killer Clowns from Outer Space. Clown-themed aliens that use cotton candy ray guns and terrorize a small town sounds stupid, and it's dumber than it sounds, but it truly is so fun. The props, the costumes, the set design especially, are way above board for a movie with this synopsis, but all of those things are part of what makes it such a great experience. L for Longlegs. Now, Longlegs has kind of become a more controversial pick over the year that it's been out. I feel like a lot of people have changed their tune or changed their opinion on Longlegs. And in fairness, when a movie comes out with the reputation of scariest movie of all time, you're going to get a lot of detractors pretty quickly. For me, however, it is one of the scariest movies of all time. The experience that I had watching it in theaters has pretty much been unmatched with any other horror film. The tension, the anxiety, the thrills of the film all throughout, to me, are just unmatched. I know it takes from Silence of the Lambs, I know it takes from Cure, and it definitely does, but I think it does those things really well and in a way that doesn't really bother me because that's what storytelling is. Nicolas Cage's performance as Longlegs, to me, is one of the all-time greats, and it kind of creeps me out in the exact right way it's supposed to. M for Midsommar. Midsommar is one of my favorite films of all time. Seeing it in theaters was truly an incredible experience. I think Florence Pugh's performance in this movie is incredible, probably the best of her career so far, and one of my favorite in horror films. Cult horror is probably the type of horror that scares me the most because it feels realistic. There's nothing more dangerous than a group of people who feel strongly about a specific subject. Also, horror that takes place in like a specific location that's far away from everything else is also creepy because it feels like there's no escape. N is for Nosferatu. I think everybody at this point was introduced to Nosferatu through SpongeBob SquarePants, and no better introduction for it than that. But the original 1920s Nosferatu film, to me, is the best depiction of Dracula in cinema history. The story is so creepy, the way that Orlok is portrayed is so creepy, and it's something that has still influenced horror films to this day. The fact that it's a silent film, I think, makes it way creepier. I liked Eggers' Nosferatu from last year, but to me, watching it kind of reinforced everything that I like about the original way more. The design, the sound elements, everything about it is just way creepier to me. O for Opal. Jack Stauber is a creative powerhouse to me. I think everything he makes has this kind of perfect, weird, creepy edge to it with kind of creative genius that you don't really see a lot in mainstream horror or pretty much anything. I know it's a short film, there might be longer films that could be better choices for this, but for me specifically, Opal, I think, is one of the best short films I've ever seen. The music's good, the animation's good, and it truly is creepy and kind of sad. P for Poltergeist. Poltergeist is another one of the greatest horror films of all time, and I think part of what makes it so great is it's a horror film for families. Pretty much anyone from any age can enjoy it, but it doesn't pull any punches even though it appeals to families. It's still creepy, it still goes very far, and it's one of the most kind of universal stories that people can resonate to because it's about family. It takes you for such a great ride. The ending is so good. There's a really great humorous heart to the film that's present throughout, even in the darkest moments. But it's a film that doesn't lean too far into protecting the viewers from the horrors of the movie. Q for Quarantine. Q is a hard letter. Not a lot out there. Quarantine is the American remake of Wreck, which is a better movie in my opinion. But, it's Q. I will say I do love the plot of it, but the plot is lifted from Wreck, so it's kind of like, what can you say? R for The Ring. The Ring is another remake of an international film, Ringu, but The Ring to me is one of those films that has creeped me out since I was a kid because of the way it was spoofed in Scary Movie 3. Because of that, it's always kind of had an influence on what creeps me out, and the Die in 7 Days thing was kind of like a meme before memes were a thing. Samara is one of the creepiest villains in horror, and I love the plot device of the videotape and how it affects people. S for The Shining. In my personal opinion, The Shining is the scariest film of all time. It is the greatest horror film of all time. I can't think of a creepier location in horror than the Overlook Hotel. The way that it manipulates whoever's in it is just fascinating to me, and I love how lived in that film is. Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall, they both give some of the greatest performances in horror. Some of the most iconic imagery from horror comes from this film, and even the sequel, Dr. Sleep, was good. T for The Thing. The Thing is right up there with The Shining for me as kind of 1 and 2 in terms of the best horror films of all time. Some of the greatest practical effects in film of all time come from The Thing. Some of the best animal actors of all time with a dog as in The Thing. The way Kurt Russell's character MacReady moves throughout the storyline and the Arctic base is really fascinating to me, and it just makes for such an interesting lived-in film. The Thing itself as an entity is super creepy to me, and there's so much potential for something like The Thing for today. U for unedited footage of a barren... If you're in my age group, you probably grew up watching Adult Swim way past the time that you should have, and were probably creeped out by every commercial that aired on it. I didn't watch unedited footage of a bear when it aired, but I watched it way after, and it still creeped me out even knowing what it's supposed to be. Essentially, it's a kind of like a drug pharmaceutical commercial that just doesn't end and turns into this weird kind of metaphysical horror thing. One of the creepiest things I've ever watched, and something that still creeps me out when I think about it to this day. V for Videodrome. David Cronenberg is one of the masters of horror and filmmaking in general, but specifically with practical effects, and body horror especially. Videodrome is one of those films that you can't stop thinking about long after it ends. This kind of rising fear of technology that happened in the 80s as things started to progress is really captured in this film in a really neat, interesting way. Some of the most striking imagery in horror films come from this film too. W for The Wicker Man. Now, I talked about Midsommar earlier. Midsommar is a film that takes a lot from The Wicker Man, but The Wicker Man is just an absolutely incredible, underrated, underseen film that everyone should go out of their way to watch. It's a slow burn. It takes a while to kind of get there, especially to get to the horror elements. The idea of this isolated community on this island and the missing person, it creeps me out thinking about it. And of course, the ending is probably one of the most famous things in film. And there's a pretty horrible remake with Nicolas Cage. X for X. Once again, man, that's a tough category. Not a lot of films out there that start with X. Not a lot of horror films out there that starts with X. But there is one pretty famous horror film called X. Unfortunately for me, I don't really like X. To be honest with you, I don't even think X is good. I also don't like Pearl, and I don't like Maxine, and I know that that means I should be beaten in the streets, but unfortunately they just didn't really do it for me. Not the worst movies I've ever seen. There are elements of X that I think are really good, especially the landslide scene I think is a really good scene. Not necessarily horror-wise, but just in general. But yeah, ultimately X doesn't really do it for me. Y for You're Next. You're Next is another one that I'm not really a huge fan of. I do like it more than I like X, for example, but ultimately just, I don't know, not that great. To be honest, I think Ready or Not does what You're Next is trying to do a little bit better. Of course, they're pretty different things, but I don't know, that kind of home horror and kind of being hunted down inside of a house, it's a similar thing. There are creepy things about You're Next, and I do like the ending of the film, and the opening scene is actually really good too. But yeah, I don't know. Z for Zodiac. Zodiac, however, is a phenomenal film, one of the best horror thrillers out there. David Fincher is kind of the master of crafting stories like this and Seven. I love journalistic films and journalistic horror. I think that that's some of the most fascinating a genre can be. Adding in the real-life elements of the Zodiac Killer with it, I think makes it extra interesting. The performances are amazing. Everybody in this film, from Downey Jr. to Gyllenhaal to Ruffalo, they're all at the top of their game. It's also one of the first films that creeped me out as a kid. I remember watching it when it came out. I think I was like 9 years old. Scarred me forever, especially the ending. So that is the ABCs of horror. These are the films that I think best represent each letter from the alphabet. Not all of them are good. Some of them are the greatest films of all time. Let me know in the comments below which films you would pick for each letter. Let me know what horror films you love. Let me know how bad you think my opinions and tastes are. That's totally cool too, as long as you do it in a respectful way. That being said, I'm Josh from Just Mash. Until next time.